Sveiki, fantastikos mėgėjai. Sveiki atvykę į šį seminarą, kuris vadinasi Kaip prognozuoti arba kurti ateitis. Mano įžanga bus lietuviškai angliška. Aš taip pat sveikinuosi su YouTube žiūrovais, ne tik su esančiais šitoje salėje. So I would like to welcome very warmly participants of this workshop and our experts as well from United Kingdom. One of them is will appear right in front of you. It's Professor Rick Callaghan. Hello, Professor. Nematom, negirdim garso tik tai, ne? Ar girdi? Jisai? Jis manęs negirdės. We don't hear you, Professor. Could you put on your microphone?
Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to be part of this event. I'm over here in the UK. I'm about 40 miles east of London. Dawn is just breaking over here. We're 2 hours behind you. I wish I could be with you, but of course this horrible COVID virus is making all our lives a little bit more difficult, isn't it? So, but hopefully this Zoom session will work well. So we're going to do our best anyway. So
thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. And taip pat mes kitas mūsų pašnekovas ir ekspertas bus Dr. Ping Zheng, but I think Dr. Ping Zheng is still not with us. She's already here, yeah? So maybe you could say hello also to Dr. Ping Zheng, if she's available.
Hello, good morning.
Hello, we hear you.
Here you go.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so say a few words to our audience.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to virtually meet you. Just wait a minute.
Yeah, it's okay, yeah.
Okay, now I can see the room. Sorry, there was some speaker audio testing at the front of me, so I couldn't see the room. Yeah, well, I think it's nice to see you all with all the masks on under this very unprecedented time. I do hope you will enjoy today's workshop.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Thank you. We'll meet a bit later, but you are welcome to stay and to take a look at my presentation. Dabar mes pradėsime mūsų seminarą nuo įžanginės prezentacijos, kurią aš parengiau apie mokslinę fantastiką, jos praeitį, jos funkcijas ir galbūt jos perspektyvas ir svarbą. Ji yra anglų kalba parengta, kad matytų ir suprastų mūsų pašnekovai, bet kalbėsiu aš lietuviškai. Galbūt tai bus greičiau ir paprasčiau. Ir po to, jeigu bus klausimų, tai vieną kitą klausimą ir man, arba taip pat ir mūsų pranešėjams bus galima užduoti. Mikrofonas yra. Kai norėsite, pakelsite ranką ir mūsų asistentės, mūsų kolegės pateiks mikrofoną. Po to bus kavos pertrauka, kadangi kava čia pat, tai galima gana neformaliai tą viską daryti. Ir po to pietų pertrauka ir po pietų mes pradėsime praktinę sesiją, kur bus jau darbas toks komandinis, manau, kad visai įdomus darbas apie tai, kaip tą kurti fantastiką, kaip kurti tas ateities vizijas ir kaip jas realizuoti paskui, arba sukurti tokias sąlygas, kad jas būtų galima realizuoti. Taigi dabar, kaip minėjau, tą trumpą mano prezentaciją. Galima įvesti ją į ekraną. Taip. Taip. Ar mokslinė fantastika yra iš tikrųjų prognozavimui skirtas instrumentas, ar tai yra daugiau pramoga? Fantastika be abejo ir mokslinė fantastika yra labai įvairus ir platus laukas. Kas domitės fantastika, manau, tokių yra tarp jūsų, turiu minį šiuo atveju mokslinė fantastika, tai yra ir distopijos, tai yra alternatyvios istorijos, laiko kelionės, kosminės operos ir panašiai ir panašiai. Nemažai autorių, kritikų, analitikų analizuoja šią sritį ir šias jos atmainas tam, kad mes galėtume geriau suprasti tą kultūrinį reiškinį. Pastaruoju metu fantastikos yra ypač daug kine, televizijoje, daugybė serialų, turbūt irgi viena iš tokių, tai Juodasis veidrodis galima reiškia prisiminti daugybę kitų. Fantastika tampa labai svarbiu kultūros reiškiniu, bet turbūt ne tik juo. Kokios yra tos funkcijos ir kokias vizijas kuria fantastika? Pirmiausia, tai yra pramoga, visions for entertainment, tai yra be abejo tokie filmai kaip Žvaigždžių karai, tai yra knygos, kosminės operos ir panašiai, tai daugiau pramoginis žanras. Tačiau yra kitos dvi gana svarbios funkcijos, tai yra inspiruojančios funkcijos, tokios kūriniai, apsakymai arba filmai galbūt kai kuriais atvejais, kurie skatina kitaip pažvelgti į ateitį, kurie mums suteikia idėjų, minčių, motyvacijos veikti, kažką kurti ir keisti. Ir taip pat yra pavojingos vizijos, kaip aš pavadinčiau, tai yra distopijos arba antiutopijos, kurios prognozuoja niūrias žmonijos ateitis arba alternatyvias ateitis tam, kad mes galėtume jas pakeisti arba jų išvengti. Kaip pasakė Juodojo veidrodžio kūrėjas Charles Brookeris, jis minėjo tą minties revoliuciją, tai yra šviečiamasis amžius. Jo manimo tai buvo svarbi minties būtent revoliucija, kuri pakeitė žmonijos istoriją ir paskatino mūsų pažangą. Aš sakyčiau, kad mokslinė fantastika ir kūriniai fantastiniai taip pat kažkuria prasme yra revoliucingi, daug tokių idėjų yra, kurios irgi pakeitė mūsų mąstymą arba kurios inspiruoja šiuolaikinius kūrėjus, verslininkus, visuomenės įvairius veikėjus. Pateiksiu keletą tik pavyzdžių. Štai pavyzdžiui, Godaras, kuris vadinamas raketų tėvu ir kuris sukūrė pirmąją raketą skystų kurų varomą, jį įkvėpė būtent Herberto Džordžo Velso kūryba. Taip pat reiškia ir Žiulio Verno Iš žemės į mėnulį knygos. Kitaip sakant, šiuolaikiniai autoriai, taip pat Elonas Muskas, kurį inspiravo Aizeko Azimovo knygų ciklas Fondas apie tarpgalaktinės imperijas, apie žmoniją pasklidusią po įvairias planetas visatoje. Kitaip sakant, tai yra literatūra, daugiausia literatūra, kuri įkvėpė tos žmonės ir jos įkvėpė toliau. Prisiminkime kelis pavyzdžius iš istorijos. Žiulis Vernas, jo knygos buvo tuo metu labai populiarios, jis rašė XIX amžiuje, daugiau galbūt antroje jo pusėje, bet jisai neįtikėtinai tiksliai numatė kai kurios dalykus. Pavyzdžiui, tai, kai jūs čia matote, knyga Iš žemės į mėnulį, kaip atrodė graviūra nupiešta, kaip atrodytų tas kosminis laivas, kurios skrenda astronautai, kaip jis iš tikrųjų atrodė ir kaip nusileido ta kapsulė su kosmonautais arba astronautais iliustracijoje tuo metu prieš 106 metus. Ir iš tikrųjų, kitaip sakant, kadangi jis tuo metu bendravo su daugybė tuo metu mokslininkų, tuo metu buvo ypatingai daug išradimų chemijoje, fizikoje, geologijoje, buvo daug keliaujama ir to labai domėjosi, dėl to sugebėjo perkelti tas idėjas į savo romanus. Ir tai labai įkvėpė, kaip aš sakau, rašytojus arba entreprenerius. Ir kita vertus, kas yra svarbu, kad kada rašytojas, fantastas arba režisierius, kaip pavyzdžiui Kubrikas, investuoja į patikimumą tų vizijų, jisai remiasi mokslininkų prognozėmis arba mokslo žiniomis, galutinis rezultatas gaunasi labai įtaigus ir meninė prasme. Kitas pavyzdys tai yra ir taip pat, ką aš ir kalbu apie tą sugebėjimą numatyti ir remtis tuometinėmis mokslo žiniomis, specialistų žiniomis. Kairėje pusėje yra Werneris von Braunas su Waltu Disneyum ir dešinėje pusėje yra jo knyga parašyta 48 metais apie Marso kolonijos lyderį Eloną. Ir ta knyga yra ne romanas, bet toks techninis romanas apie tai, kaip turėtų technologiškai būti gyvendinta idėja ekspedicijos į Marsą. Ir štai praėjo keli dešimtmečiai ir Elonas Muskas, pavardė ne ta, bet vardas tas pats, remiasi tomis idėjomis ir netgi, kaip matote, raketa, kuri buvo tuo metu nupiešta arba projektuojama, yra panaši į Musko naują raketą. Dar vienas pavyzdys yra Arturas Clarkas, kuris kažkada 45 metais sugalvojo ir pasiūlė idėją apie geostacionarinius palydovus, kurie galėtų palaikyti ryšį arba sukurti ryšį aplink Žemę. Ir ta idėja buvo įgyvendinta 63 metais. Po to Clarkas netgi juokais gailėjosi, kad neužpatentavo savo šitos idėjos. Ir čia jo yra straipsnis apie tai. Taigi, kaip matote, labai yra glaudus tas fantastų ir fantastikos ryšys su technologijomis arba su idėjomis, kurios yra kūriamos. Naujesnė istorija, tai yra, sakykime, virtualūs pasauliai, tai yra Nilo Stevensono knyga parašyta 92 metais, Snow Crash, sniego lavina, kuris kalbėjo ir sukūrė viziją, meta visatos viziją socialinės erdvės virtualios. Dabar tai jau tampa tikrovė, dabar yra sukurti tie vadinamieji žaidimų varikliai, tokie kaip Unity arba Unreal, kurie naudojami ne tik žaidimams kurti, bet daugybei kitose srityse, galima taip sakyti. Netgi treniruojami, naudojant tos variklius autonominiai automobiliai, būtent virtualiai, o ne gatvėse tikrose. Yra kuriami skaitmeniniai dvyniai, pastatų, oro uostų ir panašiai. Taip pat labai naudojama plačiai, aišku, pramogų pasaulyje, kuriant filmus, vadinamieji tie stagecraft volume, kada nebereikia žalių ekranų, viskas gaunasi geriau, kada yra erdvė, lenkta erdvė ir ten yra projektuojamas labai kokybiškas vaizdas, o atrodo, kai žiūri filmą, kad viskas iš tikrųjų ta erdvė egzistuoja. Taigi čia ta irgi tokia ateitis, meta visata tampa tikrovė. Ir dar vienas pavyzdys apie tas idėjas ir tos klausimus, etinius klausimus, filosofinius klausimus, kuriuos užduoda fantastai ir kuriuos visuomenė, politikai kartais ima aptarinėti, kartais galbūt ne. Tai kairėje pusėje yra pavyzdys Kosminio Odisėja Kubriko. Tai buvo toks pirmas labai taigus dirbtinio intelekto pavyzdys, maištaujančio dirbtinio intelekto pavyzdys. Dešinėje pusėje tai yra socialinių tinklų idėjai ir temai skirta knyga ir filmas Davido Egerso Ratas apie tas neigiamas tamsiasias socialinių technologijų ir nuolatinio sekimo, nuolatinio stebėjimo ir savęs, sakysim, filmavimo pasiekmes. Taigi čia irgi aš turiu minį, kad palaiko rašytojai, fantastai, režisieriai, jie palaiko tą diskursą, tą motyvą, tą pokalbį apie tas technologijas, ypač technologijas ir apie jų etinės pasiekmes ir ne tik technologinės mums ir visuomeniai. Todėl manyčiau, kad ir toliau ir ateityje mums tokių vizijų reikia ir reikės. Čia dar keli pavyzdžiai apie tai, kad ta hard science fiction, kietoji mokslinė fantastika arba mokslinė tekstinė fantastika, taip pat ir socialinė fantastika, jie ir toliau išlieka praktiškai priekyje, išlieka aktualūs, kadangi tai yra knygos naujausios ir filmai, kuriuose kalbama ir apie mūsų smegenų pokyčius, apie naujus vaistus, keičiančius mūsų sąmonę, apie klimato krizę, labai taigiai parašyta knyga, pavyzdžiui, Batsigalūpio, apie klonavimą, aišku, genų inžineriją, čia pavyzdys nuo Velso, kuris kalbėjo apie tuos modifikuojamus, sakysim, genetiškai daugiau ar mažiau žmonės, gyvūnus, Daktaro Moro saloje ir apie naujausius kūrinius, ta pati Margaret Atwood. Taip pat, aišku, pasaulis yra kai kur įsivaizduojamas kaip korporacijų valdomas pasaulis, tai irgi visai reali vizija. Arba, sakysime, apie autonominių automobilių, programišių perimtą valdymą. Tai yra Waltono romanas Three Laws Lethal. Kitaip sakant, tai yra puikia proga pagalvoti, remiantis fantastų vizijomis, ar tikrai taip gali būti. Ne veltui Elonas Muskas, jisai kviečia hakerius arba programiščius bandyti įsilaužti į tą Teslos autonominių automobilių sistemą, kad patikrintų jos silpnasias vietas. Mokslinė fantastika tampa praktinė ir anksčiau buvo taip pat naudojama praktiškais tikslais. Prisiminkime žvaigždžių karų koncepciją. Tai šitie du vyrukai, kurie stovi kairėje pusėje skaidrėje, tai yra Jerry Purnelis ir Laris Nivenas, garsūs rašytojai. Ir jie buvo tokie bendraautoriai tų žvaigždžių karų koncepcijos, kurią paskui Ronaldas Reiganas pradėjo vystyti, apie lazerius kosmose ir panašiai. Dabar tokie lazeriai, kaip ir sako, egzistuoja, nors galbūt šiek tiek karinė paslaptis. Ir tos idėjos jau dabar yra, taip pat grįžtama prie jų, tas pats Pensas, kaip matote čia ir tame tekste, yra, reiškia, grįžtama vėl atgaivinama nacionalinė kosmoso taryba. Tos idėjos ir toliau matyt bus vystomos. Kita vertus yra tokie kaip forumai, kaip Sigma forumas, tai yra konsultantai, kurie konsultavo Baracką Obamą jo prezidentavimo metais. Yra vienas pavyzdys apie tai, kaip mokslinė fantastika, aptiksliau filmas Gattaca, kurį galbūt teko matyti, paveikė įstatymų leidėjus. Buvo filmas apie tą žmonių skirstimą į genetiškai tobulesnius ir netokius tobulus, nes buvo galima, kadangi keis galima genetiškai žmonės patobulinti, tai tie, kurie gali sau tą leisti, tampa elitu, visi kiti ne. Tai nors filmas galbūt ten mokslinė prasme nebuvo visai tikslus, tačiau idėja buvo tokia reiškia, įtaigi, kad buvo priimtas specialus aktas Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Apie tai, jo esmė ta, kad darbdavys arba draudikas negali pasinaudoti informaciją apie asmenį, jeigu jis, pavyzdžiui, žino, kad tas asmuo turi kažkokią genetinę ligą ar kitokius kokius niuansus, tai yra draudžiama naudoti ir, pavyzdžiui, didinti jam įmokas draudimo ar panašiai, arba atleisti iš darbo. Kitaip sakant, šiuo atveju fantastika padėjo sukurti diskusiją arba įsisąmoninti, kad yra tokia problema arba jie gali iškilti ir buvo imtasi priemonių. 21 amžiuje, manyčiau, kad ta fantastikos, tas vaidmuo turbūt tik stiprės, ne tik pramogų pasaulyje, kas yra akivaizdu, bet ir kaip konsultacinio, kaip vizionieriškos srities mokslo ir pramogų srities. Nes yra įkurta, pavyzdžiui, mokslinės fantastikos konsultacinė taryba, ten yra kelios dešimtis geriausių rašytojų ir režisierių, kurie irgi prognozuoja ateitis, jie rašo apsakymus, jie kūrė kitokio tipo kūrinius apie mūsų galimas ateitis. Ir beje, tokie pavyzdžiai, kad Masačusetso technologijų institute profesoriai irgi naudoja fantastiką, fantastinius kūrinius, knygas ir filmus, mokydami, pavyzdžiui, technologinių etikos arba technoetikos, nes yra bioetika, technoetika, yra tos įvairios sritys. Ir kaip matote čia porą knygų, kaip pavyzdžiai, tai irgi bandymai interpretuoti fantastiką įvairiais aspektais. Vienas iš jų tai yra fantastika kaip evoliucinė mitologija, kaip mūsų naujoji galbūt mitologija, mūsų kaip rūšies, kaip civilizacijos mitologija. Tai, ką kažkada pradėjo galbūt Azimovas paprasčiau, cikle fondas. Dabar yra kūrinių, kurie šiek tiek labiau į filosofinę plotmę perkelia tą visą idėją. Šita knyga kaip pavyzdys, tai yra apie moralę fantastiniuose filmuose, kaip jinai skleidžiama ir ką mes galime iš to sužinoti. Kiti tokie pavyzdžiai keli, norėjau tiesiog trumpai pademonstruoti apie tą visą spektrą, kuris šiuo metu yra fantastikos tame lauke. Tai yra knygų serijos, kurias leidžia įvairios kompanijos, tokios kaip Microsoft, kaip institutai arba Masačusetso technologijos institutas pastoviai inspiruoja ir suburia rašytojus fantastus, kad jie kurtų knygas ir fantazuotų arba improvizuotų arba prototipuotų įvairias technologijas ir tai, kaip jos vystysis. Knyga, kurią jūs čia matote, tai yra viršelis knygos, kaip valdyti miestą. Jeigu jūs, pavyzdžiui, kaip miestą valdytų, pavyzdžiui, Amazonas, kaip miestą valdytų Pornhubas, kaip valdytų Tinderis ir panašiai. Yra tokios irgi trumpos vizijos. Ta knygą galima atsisiųsti iš interneto ir pasiskaityti. Kažką panašaus galbūt mes irgi bandysime padaryti šiandien. Kas yra dar svarbu, kad ne tik reiktų ir verta skaityti naujausius kūrinius, bet kadangi fantastika, šiuolaikinė mokslinė fantastika turi jau nemenką istoriją, jinai prasidėjo praktiškai 20 amžiaus viduryje. Tas aukso amžius vyko 5-6 dešimtmetyje, jisai suformavosi. Labai verta kartais paieškoti ir peržiūrėti tas idėjas, kurios jau yra knygose, kurios yra užkoduotos arba užmirštos knygose. Ir vienas iš tokių pavyzdžių tai yra kairėje pusėje esantis pavadinimas technovelgi.com, tai yra tinklalapis ir dabar veikiantis, jau senokai veikiantis apie tai, kur galima surasti įvairiausias idėjas ir kokiuose kūriniuose jos buvo pirmą kartą sugalvotos arba aprašytos. Ir čia yra pavyzdys, tas vadinamasis, aiškiai, mining, data miningas, tai tą patį galima naudoti įvairių sričių specialistams, medikams, bioetikams, technologams, galbūt ieškant idėjų, kurios paskatintų kai kurių sričių vystymas arba naujų produktų atsiradimą. Ir vienas iš pavyzdžių taip pat naujausių, dešinėje pusėje yra Čengdu miestas. Čengdu mieste yra įkurtas mokslinės fantastikos tyrimo institutas ir išleido vyriausybė to miesto, arba tik turbūt savivaldybė, reiktų taip sakyti, kaip matote, kiek milijonų dolerių, kurdami tą mokslinės fantastikos filmų, produkcijos filmų, serialų bazę. Beje, noriu pasakyti, kad pastaraisiais metais kinų fantastika tampa vis populiaresnė, vis labiau žinoma pasaulyje, būtent mokslinė fantastika ir filmai, ir knygos, ir lietuviškai yra viena kita išleista Trijų kūnų problema, pavyzdžiui. Tai irgi pavyzdys, kad labai svarbu bandyti prognozuoti ateitį, kadangi klaidos kainuoja labai brangiai, investicijų reikia labai daug, kažkokią naują produktą arba technologiją kuriant ir visada norisi kuo mažiau rizikuoti. Dėl to fantastų vizijos yra, manyčiau, svarbios ir jų praeities vizijos, ir dabarties vizijos gali iš tikrųjų kartais labai stipriai pasitarnauti. Paskutinis pavyzdys ir skaidrė, kaip rašo Kevinas Bankstonas, iš esmės kiekvienas fantastikos kūrinys turbūt yra kaip prototipas arba kaip galbūt potenciali tikrovė. Tai yra geras pavyzdys Minority Report, filmas mažumos įspėjantis pranešimas. Kaip jis buvo sukurtas, panašiai kaip jį kūrė, kaip filmą kūrė Kubrikas 2001 metų Kosminė Odisėja. Stevenas Spielbergas pasikvietė 14 futurologų, rašytojų, fantastų, savaitį laiko į gražų miestą pajūryje Amerikos, Kalifornijoje berods, ir jie fantazavo, kokios technologijos galėtų atsirasti arba būti išvystytos ateityje. Ir kuo viskas baigėsi. Filmas pasirodė 2002 metais, o 2014 metais mes jau praktiškai turėjome didžiąją dalį tenai pavaizduotų technologijų. Aš turiu minėti, tai ir veido atpažinimas, personalizuota reklama, tai yra prognozavimas, nusikaltimų prognozavimas, interfejs arba sąsajos, kurias galima valdyti gestais. Kaip matote, kairiai pusėje tai yra du vaizdai iš filmo, o čia jau vaizdai, tikri vaizdai. Ir knyga apie tą vyruką, kuris naudojasi vadinamoju jetpack reaktyvinę kuprinę arba varikliais, tai visa tai buvo tame filme. Tai yra pavyzdys, kad tokie kūriniai tampa ir pramoga, ir tampa įspėjimu arba įkvėpimu. Kitaip sakant, mokslinė fantastika, verta domėtis ir turbūt tai gali atnešti naudos ir mums visiems, ir galbūt ir Kaunui, ir visuomeniai. Tai toks mano yra pranešimas. Ačiū Jums uždėmesį, gal bus klausimų. Nes turim dar porą minučių iki profesoriaus Vyko pranešimo. Taip, jeigu ne, tai labai, manau, gerai, mes taip taupom laiką. Ar mes turime profesorių Vyką online? Professor Wick, I hope you are online. And after my brief introduction about science fiction history and future, I would like to give word to you and to your presentation, and we should start our workshop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, yes.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen with you then, and hold on, let me try and do that. Hopefully it'll all work. Yeah, and this one. And then if I make that, hold on, I'll make this full screen. Can you see that?
Yes, but please make it, okay, but viskas gerai, yeah. Yes, we see it. You can start, yes, please.
Okay, so hello again. So just before I start, we've been doing some testing of the presentation delivery just before the event, and we're obviously quite far away. So we're many thousands of miles with all this going across a network. So I was going to include some videos, but there appears to be some delay problems when we try to present the videos. So I will try and present one of the videos, but I won't present the others. But if there is a problem with the video, if somebody can just indicate that the video is unwatchable when we get there, then we can stop on that section. So that is just a little bit of background, just in case there are any issues. Yeah, so thank you very much, Rolandis, for one, inviting me, and two, for that brilliant overview that you've just given of the role of science fiction and its impact on society, and all the possibilities for science fiction. So what I'm going to try and explain to you in this first session is I'm going to take a much more practical view of how actual companies have deployed some of these science fiction ideas as part of their innovation process. And in particular, I'll be telling you about one company Intel that recognized the potential of science fiction in actually directly influencing their research and development work. And they created a process that's called science fiction prototyping that they deployed within their company and with their engineers to try and give them a competitive or an innovative edge over other companies, or at least prevent them from being, losing business due to things like disruptive technologies appearing. But I'll tell you about that a little bit as we go on, but it's going to be quite a practical take because it's actual methods that they have deployed inside Intel initially and inside other companies now. So let me commence. So I think you probably have an idea then of how the things I'm going to tell you about are going to be used in today's workshop. But just in case, let me just remind you that this morning we're going to give you a set of presentations that tell you about this science fiction methodology, and also a methodology for allowing it to be practically used in organizations and companies. That's called diegetic innovation templating. So we'll be telling you this morning in these presentations about two methodologies: one, science fiction prototyping, and two, diegetic innovation templating. And in the afternoon, you are going to then have some, little practical sessions to try test these methods out. Now, one of the reasons that we were told that we were part of this is that some of these methods were actually being considered as part of a potential competition that might be used as part of a public engagement exercise for the European City of Culture year. So just to give you a top-level overview of how this process would be used in an organization, then there's these 5 simple steps that you can see projected at the moment. Now, the first one is, so if you're an organization, so if you're a company, for example, probably what you're trying to develop is you're trying to develop a new innovative product or a new innovative service of some sort. So ultimately, if you look down at the very bottom of that slide and you see step 5, that's going to end up as a business plan of some sort. So there's going to be a product that a product or a service that a company is going to launch. But it's going to start off as some kind of science fiction-like idea right at the very beginning. So it's going to go, this process is going to take you from ideas all the way through to products. So if we were in a company, that's that's the path we follow. For today, we're only going to do a part of that process. So we're going to start off with the ideas. So the first thing that we're going to be, or you'll be doing in the practical session, is you'll be doing brainstorming, which is generating ideas. And then the second thing that you're going to do is you're going to convert those ideas into small little stories. So that's step 2 on there, which is fiction-based prototypes. And as Roland has said, many people have already recognized the fact that science fiction stories, and indeed any story, is a prototype, is a form of prototype of our lives or our possible lives. So today, that's what we'll be doing. We'll be looking at step 1, brainstorming, converting, which generates ideas, converting those ideas into small stories. Now, if we were an organization or a company that was trying to deploy it, we couldn't stop at just having a story. So no matter how good that story was, how good a product is described, there'd be other steps that we'd have to follow in order to translate that story into a practical product or service. So that's really what those other steps are on there, that 3, 4, and 5 that eventually end up with a product. So we'll do the first 2 of those today, and then Ping is going to tell you a little bit about how you start taking stories and translate them into products. But you're really not going to do anything more with that than just understand the process. So today you're going to start with ideas and turn those into stories. So then about stories, of course, stories are things that we're completely familiar with. So I guess just like me, many of you will, from a very early age, have been exposed to stories. So it may have been your parents, reading you fairy tales when you were young, and of course the thing about stories, if you've got a very well written story, it immerses you in another world. So as you're listening to a story, as you're reading a story, as you're watching a movie, if it's very well told, your whole mind gets transferred into that other world. And it's as though, as you're reading that story or watching that movie, it's as though you're kind of living in that other world. You're experiencing that other world. And if the characters if the characters have problems or something happens to them, you can feel genuinely sad. Your emotions can make you feel sad about their plight. If they have successes, you feel happy. If they're interacting with the world in some way, and if they feel confused or elated about something, you feel those very same emotions. So if a story is very well written, it can immerse you into that world. It's as though you're living in that world. Now, another perspective on stories is that at one level, we imagine that someone else is kind of writing stories that we consume, that we read. But actually, all of us are generating stories all the time, because our lives are just stories. So for example, if you went away on a holiday and you came back and you met your parents and you were telling them about your holiday and you were telling them about all the characters you met, for them, they haven't been on that holiday. For them, it's just a story that you're telling them. But if you tell that story well, it's like they've been there as well. And if you tell it really well, I mean, you might excite them. They might think that place is so, that place that you've been to for your holiday is so extraordinary and so exciting that they'd like to go there. And the same if you've got friends, for example, who buy a car and you're sitting there talking to them and they tell you about some of their experiences with the car. They're really telling you a story because you haven't been in that car with them. You haven't been in those places, but you may get excited by that story about the car so much that you may buy that car, for example. Now, of course, one of the processes of when you listen to a story, when someone's telling you a story, because you haven't been there, you're having to imagine it inside your head. And so the process of kind of reading stories makes you imagine things. It fuels your imagination. So you may be imagining it exactly as it happened, or you may be imagining it in a slightly different way. So it depends, how that story is told as to how you imagine it. And of course, as you write stories or as you tell stories, to some extent, you're exercising your imagination. So stories are also kind of fuel of imagination. Now, because we're all familiar with stories, stories also act as a good communication vehicle. So, you know, like I was explaining, when your parents come, or when you come back from a holiday and you're telling your parents about your holiday, and you're telling them a sort of story, you're also communicating with them. So stories are excellent for communication. And if you were in a company, for example, and you might have highly qualified scientists and engineers with a certain set of skills, and you may have people in marketing with a completely different set of skills, and you may have customers with you know, a whole diverse bunch of skills. Sometimes it's difficult for those different stakeholders of innovations or products to communicate properly with each other. But through stories give you that power. They're also a communication vehicle. So stories do lots of things. You know, stories immerse us in other worlds. So they create prototypes of other worlds, of other products. They enable communication between us, and they drive our imaginations. They exercise our imaginations. So for all those reasons, Intel saw a huge opportunity in the use of stories. Because one of the things when you're designing, when you're trying to create products inside companies, you're trying to imagine something that doesn't exist. So if it's a new product, it doesn't exist in any way. So you're somehow trying to imagine it and imagine how it might be used. And you're trying to convey that imagination of the product and of how it might be used to other people. So you know, through a story, you're able to do that. So inside organizations, then, that's how this technique we're going to explore tends to be used. It's used as a fuel of imagination to drive creative processes. It's used as a communication vehicle between the different stakeholders inside an organization, or in the case of the Europeans' Year of Culture, you know, between members of society. And it acts as a prototype. It acts as a model of whatever that concept that you're trying to get across is. So this is then, so those are all the reasons that drove Intel about 10 years ago to start looking at science fiction as a means to drive some of their internal innovation programs. So just as a little bit of extra background on what drove Intel into using science fiction prototyping. One of the things that, you know, if you're a large company, one of the things that you're incredibly scared of is disruptive innovations. So for example, when Kodak were the kind of leading company in producing photographic material in the days when photographs occurred on chemical films, what they didn't foresee is that there was a new technology, charge coupled devices, that were going to come along and allow digital images to be made. Instead of images being on chemical films, they'd be on semiconductor devices. And so they didn't foresee that. And so when that disruption came along, that technological disruption came along, they hadn't seen it. They almost went out of business at the time. And Intel had seen these things with companies happening, and they thought that, well, whatever happened to them, they never wanted to find themselves in a position where an unforeseen innovation had come along and virtually destroyed their business. So they tried to set up an internal program inside Intel to guard against that. And so they tried many schemes. So the first scheme they tried is they just, so they looked at themselves as a company, And when they looked at themselves as a company, they realized that most of their resource, most of the value of their company was actually in the employment of scientists and engineers. Most of their money, most of their outgoings was paying scientists and engineers. And so when they were trying to guard themselves against disruptive innovations coming along in the future, they looked to those scientists and engineers to kind of help them in some way. So their first attempt was they just said to their scientists and engineers, you know, how do you think science and engineering, or how do you think science is going to evolve? What sort of things should we start looking at now to protect us against potential innovations in the future? So they said they tried that with their engineers, and it was pretty hopeless. It really didn't really get anywhere for them. And they said what they got back from engineers is they got back very incremental suggestions about how technology might develop. And so no matter how hard they tried to convince their engineers to take a leap forward into the future, they said their engineers were always very conservative when talking about the future, and always would do very conservative things. And in the end, they ended up thinking that it was something to do with the education system. And they thought, well, you know what happens? When students go to university and they're training to be scientists or engineers, it's a highly methodological process. You teach people to build on current knowledge and to try and advance it by kind of making adjustments to it. You know, so if you've got something like a bridge, for example, that's being designed, then you'd look, the way you'd kind of design new bridges is you'd look at old bridges and you'd use all the methodologies that have been used in designing old bridges and just advance them a little bit. And the one thing, if you're following engineering courses, or if you're producing engineering products, is you want to avoid anything at all going wrong. For example, if you've got a bridge, the one thing you don't want is you don't want the bridge collapsing. Or if you're designing airplanes or airplane technology, you know, it's safety first all the time. And so all these things conspire to make engineers very cautious. So their dilemma was, how do they get around that? How do they stop that happening? And so they tried an experiment, and the experiment was they went back to those engineers and they said to them, what we'd like you to do is we'd like you to write us a fictional story about your research. So we'd like you to write something that kind of foresees where the technologies you are working on right now might go, but we don't want it to be true. You know, it mustn't be anything that's grounded in current facts. It must be fictional. And they said, so we want you to write a story, a fictional story about your area. So when they did that, they said it was an immediate transformation. Instead of getting all these little incremental kind of ideas, they started getting these highly imaginative, leaps in what was possible. And so they realized at that point that there was something very powerful in fiction and in stories, and that by bringing narrative fictions together with conventional science, they could do really extraordinary things, that they could get ideas that were well outside, you know, out of the box. And so that was the birth of science fiction prototyping. So then they realized that when they got their engineers to write those stories, that they could take those stories and present those stories to potential customers and say, you know, if we were to build this kind of device, you know, would this, you know, is this something that would be useful in your life, and that you'd buy it? And instead of it being loaded with technical jargon that, you know, ordinary lay people couldn't understand, it was a story, and you could read the story. And then you could, if there was elements in the story that you liked, and other elements that you didn't like, you could say, oh, so, yeah, I really like that. I really like that life. I could imagine myself living in that life, and I'd like it. But what I don't like, what I wouldn't like, is this part here. So you can then modify the story. So instead of it being a static story that somebody creates, it becomes a dynamic story that's kind of modified by all the different stakeholders inside it. So you've got the scientist who's contributed to creating the story. You've got people at marketing that might be looking, or in the production side, they're saying, oh, we can't do that. That's too, and they've modified the story in some way. And then you've got customers that come in, members of society that modify. So they then realized that they had something that not only drove imagination, but it kind of linked all these diverse stakeholders together to create a prototype. So this was a prototype, but it wasn't a prototype in the conventional sense. It was a prototype that was dynamic because it was being changed, and it was a prototype that enabled people with diverse backgrounds and diverse skills to collaborate around and doing. And so they then realized that it wasn't only something that was going to protect them against disruptive innovations, but it was something that could fuel some of their core business. And so that's why they really got excited about about science fiction prototyping and started deploying. And that's where I got involved with them, because then they wanted to deploy that out into the world. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and play a video to you that we made back in those days. So this was about 9 years ago that I first started working with Intel on some of these things. And their initial step was to try and roll these things out as workshops to interact with the general academic and science and engineering community to get feedback on it, and then out into the wider world. So this video will give you an early insight to this. So I'm going to try and play it, but don't forget, this may not work. So if it doesn't work, somebody get back to me and stop me somehow. So let me try. So it's only a very short video. It's only about 2 minutes, I think, from 2011, I think.
So the Creative Science Foundation puts on an event every year, and it brings together scientists and designers and artists to really use science fiction prototyping as a way to explore the research and the design work that we're doing.
What's going on here is an attempt to bring science fiction to bear on today's kind of technological challenges.
The goal of the Creative Science Foundation is to provide a means for all the stakeholders in this society to have a say as to how we shape the future. We all, share this environment. So, what do we want this world to be like?
The idea behind science fiction prototyping is science fiction based on science fact as a development tool.
It's important because it's the only way that we have to explore a lot of the questions that arise. These aren't things that you can test very easily a lot of the time. They're not things that you can take out into the world, because a lot of the time they don't exist yet.
It's important to have a chance to sort of step back from and have a look at technology in relationship to ideas of politics, and think about how we might like for things to be, as opposed to just kind of rocketing forward without reflecting on these things. Scientific innovation doesn't just come out of nowhere.
I mean, a lot of people enjoy reading science fiction, but in my area, at least in space, it's also been used to not only to speculate on futures, but also to communicate them to a general public, or even to provide a context for technology.
By putting it into a fictional world, we get to understand the implications on people and the implications on culture. But not only that, it also allows us to share those ideas. Not all of us are physicists or biologists biologists, but if we take that science and put it into a story and surround it in a world, and then we can share it with other people.
I sit in a room of physicists every single day. To sit in a room with a biologist, a sociologist, a mathematician, a chemist, an English literature expert, a fiction writer, an Intel expert. It's a fascinating experience.
Close to my heart because as a science communicator you're spending a lot of time thinking about where technology will take you next. It's an interesting kind of way of exploring the challenges that technology throws up and the kind of the social issues as much as anything that it generates.
I think it's interesting to see how different disciplines use it and also how they manifest it in the end. So I think we saw a lot of different ways of how people approached the stories and how they manifested them in the end.
Really, I think what they're doing is trying to facilitate a science-based conversation about the future that we want to live in.
A lot of the kind of questions that that technology creates for society, for human beings, are only really amenable to an imaginative approach, and that's science fiction.
Okay, so that gives you a little insight then into what the roots of science fiction prototyping and Intel's role in it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to now move on and look at some of the methods of creating these fictions. So as you can see down on this slide, there's two principal kinds of science fiction prototype. So now, in order for a science fiction prototype to be useful, to convince you to invest a lot of money, so millions of euros into something, then it would have to be a pretty well written and tested story. You can imagine then, if it's a pretty well written and tested story, it's probably fairly complete. So it's a fairly large kind of story. So there's two kinds of science fiction prototypes. There's ones that are fairly large and very complete, that are used to convince the CEO of a company about a change of direction of that company, about putting substantial funds into investing in a new product. And then there's another smaller kind of science fiction prototype that's used to capture ideas. So to capture, to take an idea and just to translate it into a fairly minimal story that you can use as banter between a number of people, just to quickly compare various ideas and stories. So if you've got a big science fiction prototype, you'd have to sit down for a number of hours and read that. Then, so these very small ones that you can read very quickly and just get an idea of whether the ideas is a starter at all. So that's these two types of science fiction prototypes that are down here. There's micro science fiction prototypes, and there's macro or mini science fiction prototypes. And today, you can imagine to construct a macro or a mini science fiction prototype, a big science fiction prototype. That would take some time. So we don't have time in this workshop to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the very small science fiction prototypes that are called micro science fiction prototypes. So I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to spend most of the time telling you about micro science fiction prototypes and how to use those. And actually, for the application that you have in mind, I think there's an awful lot of advantages on these micro science fiction prototypes. But we'll have a look anyway. So So often, you know, if I was at university and I was kind of talking about this, giving a presentation like this, and you didn't have prior sight of my notes, I don't know if you've seen my notes already or my slides already, if they're in your pack or not. But if I was doing this at university, what I would ask students is I would ask them, what's the smallest kind of story they that they think is possible to write? And generally, you know, I get replies to that are up in the hundreds of words or thousands of words. Generally, you know, people never imagine that you can write really tiny stories. And of course, it turns out, for those of you that have got a literature background, that you'll know that there's a whole area of literature that's just called microfiction, and it's about writing very small stories. And there's a lot of people who really love the challenge of just writing very, very short stories. And in actual fact, you know, there is a story, as I noticed that Rolandus had on one of his slides, he mentioned Arthur C. Clarke. So there's a story that comes from Arthur C. Clarke, or he reported on it, and it was about an American author called Ernest Hemingway. And, you know, supposedly somewhere in the, I don't know, 1930s, 1940s, apparently he was at a dinner party somewhere, and with fellow authors, and they put out a challenge at this dinner party, you know, as to who could write the smallest fiction. And they kind of, in a sense, you know, all made bets on who could write the smallest fiction. And apparently Ernest Hemingway, he said he could write it in 6 words, and so everyone else backed out and left him write this story in 6 words. And so that story, that first microfiction that he wrote, is really quite famous. And it was something like it went something like, for sale, baby shoes never worn. So 6 words: for sale, baby shoes never worn. And of course, the thing about that story, that, you know, if you think about having some little baby shoes for, you know, shoes for a baby, and that they were never worn, it raises all sorts of questions in your mind as to, you know, what could have happened. You know, was that a tragic? Was there some tragedy at work there? Did someone have a little baby and the baby died? You know, so you know, there's various emotions that are teased out of you when you just hear those 6 words. So, you know, according to Arthur C. Clarke, that was the beginning of these microfictions. So a lot of people have become fascinated with writing microfictions, and if you go into Google and just type microfiction, you'll find lots of sites on there that kind of that act as repositories for microfictions. So down here on this slide, I've just shown some of those. So I've given some examples of some of these, you know, very small microfictions. So somewhere over on the left of that screen there, you can see a couple of examples of 6 word or less microfictions. So the first one there is, it says lie detector. Lie detector eyeglasses perfected. Civilization collapses. So, you know, if you imagine that something like, you know, Google Glass. So if you imagine a pair of glasses like this, and they've got, you know, a camera in there, and it kind of does facial recognition on whoever you're looking at. And there's a processor that interprets that and kind of analyzes as to whether whatever I'm saying is truthful or not. If you were to go around in the world and be able to tell if people were telling lies or not tell lies, or, you know, even small little kind of fibs, imagine how that would change the world. So, you know, when you come home, when you come home at night and your partner asked you, something like, oh, I've had a tiring day, I must look awful. And you say, no, you look wonderful, you look very beautiful. And the lie detector in there kind of came up and said, telling lies. Imagine how that would affect all kind of social interaction and things like that. So that's what that kind of story is saying, is that actually human society, a small bit of kind of telling white lies is kind of part of who we are. That we kind of bend the truth all the time and kind of, overemphasize things, underemphasize things, slightly say things just to make society work and things in various ways. Okay, so there's so you can write stories as short as 6 words. So of course we're in a very technological age at the moment. So if we were trying to write short fiction, how many words would we pick? Well, at the time, when mobile phones were kind of emerging, one of the mechanisms of communicating on mobile phones was to send text messages. And then Twitter came along and you could send short messages on Twitter. So people immediately started to think, okay, so why don't we make a genre where we have short stories that could be sent as text messages or Twitter messages? And that then gave you a size. A text message is 160 characters, and a Twitter message was 140 characters. So they just translated that into a number of words in various languages. So in English, that comes out to about 30 words. So that then became a form of microfiction, where you could write stories. So for science fiction prototyping, then there was big stories and short stories. Well, because it was kind of very based in technology, they chose to do it with the Twitter science fiction. And so it's about 30 word stories. So now, bearing in mind that the purpose of science fiction prototyping was to create visions, innovations of one sort or another, then the stories had some restrictions placed on them. So you knew the story was going to be about an innovation of some sort. So there was going to be an idea for doing something, and that's going to be translated into a story. But that idea is a potential innovation. It's going to be doing something in a new way. And if you're going to be doing something and the purpose is that the purpose of this innovation is that if you're a company that it's going to make money, for example, then it's got to have a benefit with it. It's got to benefit customers in some way. So these stories, then the restrictions are that they have to describe an innovation. They have to illustrate it doing something, and that something should have a benefit of some kind. So when someone looks at that story, they can understand what the innovation is, what it does, and how it benefits their life in some way. So if you look on here and you see, so if you look at bullet point 4 on here, you'll see that it gives a simple micro science fiction template. So the basic format of a science fiction prototype. And you see in it that it's got a person that's using, so a person in some kind of context, a person that uses something, the innovation, to do something. So it's, it's performing some action in the world, and it's going to provide a benefit. So inside this 25 or 30 words, that's what one has got to get into, this very short story. So one of the the thing about writing very short stories, if you haven't done it before, sometimes it can feel difficult. So there's various ways that people set about trying to make that easier for people that don't have much experience in writing stories. So one tip that's often given is, well, in the first instance, don't try to write it as an extremely short story, that's 30 words, allow yourself to make it a little bit longer and then just shorten it down. So sometimes that's helpful, but generally just the procedure is this that I've written out on here, this simple writing procedure. So you'll think of an innovation, and that innovation will either come out of your imagination, so it could come out just from your own imagination, or it could come out of a process. And for example, the process that you're going to do later this afternoon is called brainstorming. So that's one way of generating ideas. So to write this story, you've got to have a pool of ideas. So you've got to have a selection of ideas. So you've got a problem, you're faced with a problem, what you need, or you're faced with a problem, and that problem might be, we're losing our competitiveness as a company. How do we introduce a new product that will give us more competitiveness? So, we're faced with a problem. So you've got to generate ideas to solve that problem. That's where brainstorming that you'll do this afternoon is going to come in. It'll generate a pool of ideas. From those pool of ideas, you then would select an innovation of some sort. So something, that's going to distinguish your service, your product, whatever it is you're trying to do from someone else. So you'd pick from that pool of ideas an innovation, and that innovation, for it to be usable by people, then you need to then have a person in the story. So you need to have an innovation. So you choose that innovation. You choose a person that's going to be in the story. You just give them a name, any name. If you're trying to keep characters short, you give them a short name. And then that innovation is going to do something. So you have an event. So that's where it says on there, create an event. And then, of course, it's just going to include a benefit. And that's it, really. So you just try and, without even writing a story, you would just try and list all those items separately. So you'd list an innovation, you'd list the name of a person, you'd list the event they were doing, and you'd list the benefit. And then when you've got those, you then try and turn that into a kind of story. And remember back to when we were talking about stories at the very beginning, the key in stories is that they're engaging, that they engage you, and if possible, that they would immerse you in some way. But of course, when you've got a very short story, it's limited what you can do in those things, but you're still doing your best to make it as readable and as eye-catching, engaging a story as you can inside those 30 words. It is difficult to do that, but it is possible. Now, why would you do those things? Well, the reason that you do any of those things is, the reason you do it is because ultimately you're trying to generate those larger science fiction prototypes that convince people to release big amounts of money to do something significant in the world, to make some big change of some sort. So this is really just a first step. This is a starting point. So when you get that microfiction, if you look at that microfiction, you'd look at a number of microfictions, and when you select one that you liked, you would then translate that into a bigger fiction. So the advantage of microfiction is it's very fast, because you can see those steps that I put down on there. It wouldn't take you that long to kind of sit down and write out, to write those, provide all those items in those steps and to put it together as a story. It would be much, much faster than you trying to write a large story. So you can generate a lot of these short stories and then select which is the better of those to translate into a large one. So that's really, that was the key to why microfiction came about, is in situations where you needed to generate a lot of stories, you needed to generate them quickly, or people were very busy. So, you know, inside Intel, before people would commit to a day or 2 days of writing a large prototype, they could create these micro science fiction prototypes really quickly, in minutes, or, you know, something along that time. And then you could get a pool of these short little stories and then decide where you're going to invest your effort. So we've ran these things quite often, micro science fiction prototyping workshops or exercises. And this is just to give you some idea of what's happened in the past. So this was a few years ago, and this was with pre-university students. So they were, as you can see on the screen, they were 16 or 17 years old. The entire session was from explanation through to them doing things was only 90 minutes in length. And they came up with, between them, I don't know, there was about 25 of them. They came up with, yes, a few hundred probably of these little micro science fiction prototypes. And this is a small selection of them there. So, you know, you've got to understand from their world, because people can only write science fictions from their understanding of the world, from their understanding of technologies and where they might go. So, you know, everybody will start from a different place. Some people will be more expert than others. And, you know, some people will be more imaginative than other people will. But you can see that these various ones here. So if you look at that top one, it's got a character called Jack. So, you know, Jack fell asleep in the sun, and his technology is he's got a smart wristwatch of some kind, and his smart wristwatch has got sensors that detect the sun inside it. So, you know, so Jack fell asleep in the sun. His smart sun protector in the form of his watch woke him. It vibrated, it did something with an alarm, and that stopped him getting sunburn. So it was as simple as that, really. So as I've said earlier, then the whole goal is to, if you're inside an organization or a company or anything where you're going to commit significant resource, then the next step on would be to select from those tens or hundreds of micro science fiction prototypes, ones that have more promise, and then convert them into mini or macro science fiction prototypes, more substantial science fiction prototypes that could convince whole companies to invest, you know, like millions of pounds, or government organizations to invest significant resource into something. So there's a whole technique in writing these larger fictions, by the way, and there's there's books written about it. So there's a book written by the person that you saw in that video right at the beginning, Brian Johnson. He's written a book called Science Fiction Prototyping, and that kind of details, it gives in quite a lot of detail, all the steps and how you set about writing these larger fictions. Well, because the whole workshop is geared at looking at you know, potentially looking at something, or looking at whether science fiction prototyping could be used as a public engagement exercise for you know, Kaunas as year of culture, then the idea of what you're going to do this afternoon was you were going to look at the, you know, the future visions for the city of Kaunas. So whether, you know, so that could, you know, be very wide ranging, because you know that if you're in a city, that you're basically part of a large ecosystem. So there's you, these other people, these buildings, there's transport, there's resources of various sorts, there's technologies that we all carry or that are inside businesses. And so there's lots of agencies and agents at work inside cities, and they all interact in different ways to collectively make that city function in a way. And as you saw from, you know, Rolandus's presentation, you know, technology and, you know, so science and technology, you know, has got a huge potential to affect things like cities and city life. Because when you look at our cities, they're effectively this ecosystem, and one of the key ingredients in that ecosystem is technology. So technology, you know, can be holding resources that you need to access. It can be facilitating communication. It can be carrying you about the place. It can be keeping you safe. It can be, you know, it can be making the city greener, you know, making efficient use of energy. You know, there's so many possibilities in this connected system, that, you know, the ecosystem that we call cities. So the focus for the brainstorming this afternoon is going to be around smart cities. But when you're thinking about cities, and you've just got to think of them in that widest concept of, you know, an ecosystem of absolutely everything. And, you know, and so, you know, how could that ecosystem of absolutely everything be arranged to, you know, to improve life in some way, to bring benefits by rearranging things, or by, you know, or by introducing new things, or by just looking at subparts of that, you know, how could that be altered? So the microfictions you'd be writing would be about, yeah, a future Kunis, and how and changes and things that could happen, new innovations that would be brought in, modifications to how things are done at the moment that would produce dramatic benefits. You know, so the bigger the benefits, obviously, the better. Now, as part of that, you're going to so this afternoon you'll be given a sheet that'll have various starting ideas on it. What I was going to do at this point, and I apologize for not being able to do that, is I was going to show you some videos of emerging technologies, but unfortunately these videos are not performing very well, and these particular videos are quite sensitive on sound. And they were just going to give you examples. So these are projects that some of the team that I work with been involved with. So if I can just briefly, just verbally explain what you would have seen, just to give you an idea. So on the list you're getting, you know, you'll see that one of the things is on their list this afternoon. One of the things is voting. Well, there was an EU project that I was involved with that was looking at the future of voting and how voting could happen in different ways. So what that video would have shown you would have showed you a way where you can log on to a system and you can enter a virtual world. And then if you are voting on an issue, because, you know, just imagine that in the city that you're living, that there was a proposal to save energy by making some significant change to the pattern of behavior in that city, then that would be something that would have to be decided. So you can have either the politicians deciding that, or you could try and involve the population in those decisions. So this bottom one is called Plus Spaces. That was that was a video that showed an EU-funded project that we undertook, where citizens of a community would kind of log in wherever this issue, log into the system, and then inside this virtual world, they would move around. It was like a big hall, and they could move around, and there was like poster boards inside there that gave them information. And the poster boards were interactive, so they could ask questions and explore and find out more information. And eventually, they voted by actually moving themselves into a position there. So it was like a crowd, you know, all the people that think this way move over onto this area, and the people that move the people that think a different way move over into another area. So that was just to give you an idea of really what you could do with virtual reality in relation to kind of changing the way things might be done inside a city. The other one there that says British Telecom, that's one of our colleagues in the Creative Science Foundation. She works for British Telecom, and British Telecom are our national network provider. So all the interconnectivity in our cities and across our country is provided by British Telecom. Well, that takes a huge amount of maintenance to maintain systems like that. And so she was involved in creating a new technology that, what I should also say is that, so they've got this huge network to maintain, but they've also got an aging population. So a lot of the expertise of people, they're kind of my age, and some of those people are kind of, retiring and moving out of the system. So they realized as a company, they were going to lose a huge portion of their expertise was just going to leave, and they were going to get younger people in, but who didn't have the expertise of their networks. So what they decided to do is they decided to use things like Google glasses, so smart glasses. And when engineers went around and fixed faults, they wore those glasses, and those glasses captured what they were doing and how they did it. And then they used AI to capture and understand how that person fix that fault. And the idea was then that later somebody, so later a younger person, say, who had no experience of fixing some of those systems, would just put on those glasses again, and then they would be guided through the process by the AI, which had recorded all these kind of, all the examples of people fixing those particular systems in the past, all their engineers that had done all that work in the past, and guide them through it, and
Professor?
then he would train them effectively on the job.
Professor, thank you very much, but I'm afraid we are now having to break for coffee. So
Yeah.
do you have your final words?
Yeah, well, we're right there. We're just at the end. So, anyway, so I hope this has given you some brief introduction into what science fiction prototyping is. The best way to learn anything in life really is to do it. So, it's not particularly efficient to listen to someone telling you about those things. The way you really learn is by actually doing it. So hopefully this will have helped, and hopefully you'll enjoy this session where it's practically done. So thank you very much. It's a bit funny, by the way, because I can't really see. I've got this tiny little view of you. I can't really see you. It's anything creative like this is always best done face to face. So this is very unusual. We don't do these sessions, online really. We always do them face to face, and it's a bit of a strange feeling for me to be trying to present this way, but
that's a kind of innovation. Yeah, we are forced to do, maybe. Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor.
Okay,
Thank you for your ideas. Now, briefly, thank you. Now we'll break for coffee. We have 15 minutes, and after that we will have Dr. Ping Zheng with her presentation. Aš norėčiau informuoti YouTube žiūrovus, kad transliacija, kurią jūs žiūrite, tai yra seminaras, mokslinio-fantastinio prototipavimo seminaras, skirtas kaip kurti ateities vizijas. Building visions for the future. So now we are breaking for coffee and we'll be back in 15 minutes. Grįžime po 15 minučių. Dar kartą sveiki, grįžtame į mūsų mokslinio fantastinio prototipavimo seminarą, kuris vadinasi Kaip sukurti arba kurti ateities vizijas, Building Visions for the Future. Dabar antroji pirmosios dalis. Mes kviečiame daktarę Ping Zheng iš Jungtinės karalystės, kuri kalbės apie Transforming Science Fiction Prototyping into Actionable Plans. So, Dr. Ping, we now ask you to take the floor and to start your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good break. Enjoy, the early morning sessions. Well, in this session, I'm going to talk about science fiction, fantasy, and innovation, particularly their relationship, the transformation between science fiction, fantasy, to the real innovation, because probably everyone can make imagination. But I think the challenge is how to transform those imagination of the future, those visions of the future, stories of the future into a real product innovation or real innovation in our real world. So moving from the fictional world to the innovation world, they require a process. We have designed a methodology based on our empirical research. We'll be able to illustrate on that process, how that can happen. Well, I think this methodology would be a very important one, because this methodology actually has been developed based on science fiction prototype. So we are going to talk about the grounding of this methodology, and also we're going to talk about in the practical application of this methodology. To make it easy to understand, I'm going to use a lot of examples to illustrate on how this is going to happen. Well, I think before I started on this topic, I would like to make a little bit change on the way we, deliver this workshop, because I think due to this very, virtual situation, we seem unable to interact. So I would say I'm going to talk every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes, I'm going to stop and ask you questions. And you will be able to at least interact with me virtually rather than just me talking on the screen for 40 minutes. I think that's probably, it's not very desirable, to be honest. It won't make your experience very enjoyable either. So I would like to propose this more interactive way to deliver this workshop. In that way, I think we can both communicate each other, so I can get to know you. Because at the moment, all I can say is, very small figures on my screen. Everyone wear a mask, so I even don't know how you look like. In addition to that, as you listen and to what I say, if you have any question, I would encourage you to raise hand. I'm not sure, on the Zoom, but the Teams, the Microsoft Teams we used, they have raise hand function. So I can say who raised the hand, I can immediately answer that question. But the Zoom probably a different function. So if you raise your hand, I can see from the screen, I probably can give a pose and then to say what your question's about. Rolando and everyone, are you happy with this way?
My raised hand, yeah? Oh, it's okay. Go for it, yeah.
I haven't got the response, so I would assume,
maybe questions after your presentation, yeah.
This. Okay, let's talk about, I think this particular relationship between science fiction, or we simply call it fantasy, because a lot of imagination, a lot of literature, fiction, novels, they're not probably in the form of science fiction. So we call them fantasy. They're the fantasy, they are distanced and from our reality. But those fantasies, they actually, have a lot of fun. They have the power. They have the power to impress people. They have the power to make people remember that. They also have the power, to change people's mindset. I think there is a certain key literature studying the science fiction or the impact of fiction on shaping people's decisions. There has been quite a wide range of literature on that topic. But the major literature, which especially underpins this diegetic innovation template methodology, is on three major streams. One is on science fiction prototyping. I believe Vic has explained quite a lot about science fiction prototyping. And from this methodology, and we can say they initially used in engineering, in science, how they develop these narratives, scenarios, and for future products description. They are powerful because I think a story remade. As the old saying say, if you tend to, we tend to forget things, but we don't forget is what we recorded in stories. So the narrative certainly has the power. The science fiction prototyping has demonstrated and such a power of narratives, the power of imagination, how they eventually transform to product prototyping, and that prototyping eventually, realized and in certain timeline. But I'm not going to talk too much about science fiction prototyping. However, what I want to address is this is actually become the foundation and for our methodology. The relationship between science fiction prototyping and the diegetic innovation templating is actually, when we initially worked on the future studies, we worked on science fiction prototyping as our first step of research. When we did our empirical research, we initially aimed to try to identify how the science fiction prototyping worked in non-science industries and contexts, organizations, which they were not in the engineering or hard technology sector. For example, like fashion industry, marketing and the service and this industry. So how the science fiction prototyping worked, how the full science narrative worked in those industries. Because when we did this research back to 2010, there was almost a gap in this subject area. There was no understanding how this methodology would work and in the non-science sector. So we took this method, we designed the research and to investigate in those non-science sector with case studies. To be honest, and surprisingly, they came back with a very different way of integrating science fiction or fictions and into their product innovation. Completely opposite and to the science fiction prototype methodology, established. So they did backward way. Science fiction prototyping is to imagining the future and develop the scenario about the future product prototyping. But in the service and non-science industry, actually, they think that's not effective for them. They can't say, how they could close the distance between the future and their reality. So in reality, what they're doing, they not only integrate science fiction, but they also integrate social, culture, fictions, and the wide range of literatures and the films, fantasies, and from different sources as their source of creative ideas. And for that, they call the social cultural fiction prototyping. That has been some established literature recognized the use of this kind of social cultural fiction. If you look at one of the significant milestone work on this will be Schua's. Our work actually very much cited Schua's work because he particularly emphasized the importance of the integration of social culture elements and into science fiction prototyping. So this is a melee and the 2 blocks of work and supporting or underpinning, our diegetic innovation templating. So come back to diegetic innovation templating. There is also another significant work, but not in sociology, not in future studies. They actually talk about in film studies. They use the work diegesis. Diegesis referring to the fictional settings in film, in novels, especially in films. Those fictional settings referring to those artifacts they used in the fictional settings. It's sound artifacts, for example, before we had a mobile phone, and in the film, they already had a mobile phone, and there's a prototype used in the fictional settings. And that is called a diegetic prototype. So in Kirby's work, and Kirby particularly talk about, how these diegetic prototypes, those fictional, artifacts inspired the real product development in the real world. And then their work and showed, especially with the example in 1980s, that in the film, at that time, the heart transplant operation was not in reality, but in the film, they showed quite scientifically and how that operation could happen. So in that film, very touching film, how a girl and her life got saved by this heart transplant, but that was in the film. However, that story was so touching in the film, and that inspired the doctors and scientists really invested into that. So just 2 years later, the real transplant happened in the real world. So in his diegetic prototype, they talk about how the fictional artifacts in these fictional settings can become the sources of inspiration and the sources of idea and for the real life innovation. So this is basically, I think the foundation, the conceptual foundation for diegetic innovation templating this particular methodology. Is there any question about this part? Anyone want to ask a question about this part?
So do we have questions? Maybe later at the end of your presentation, I believe.
Okay, yeah,
okay,
sure,
yeah.
No problem. I just going to ask, for probably intervally, just in case anyone has a question. Okay, now we talk about the diegetic innovation templating. So build upon the science fiction prototyping, social culture fiction prototyping, and the diegetic prototyping. Then we introduce this diegetic innovation templating method. And this is referring to a model that means the organization or innovators, and they can extract the innovations in the form of templates, which I'm going to show you later in the later slides. And they actually extracted the innovation from a wide range of sources of ideas in fictional settings. And they extracted those we call the elements of the innovations. So the innovators is very much like a designer. They design their innovation idea based on the ingredients and they picked from different sources. And it's like, very master skilled chef. And in order to cook this delicious dish, and which is very different from others, and they can take the ingredients and from those unexpected sources. And those unique ingredients make the idea unique. And then, but I think the challenge for the innovators is how they integrate those ingredients and into their recipe. That requires them to translate into their potential product design. And they also need to develop their innovation capability in order to deliver that. Because idea prototype is one thing, but delivering that idea prototype is another thing. And then, unsurprisingly, at the end of this using of diegetic innovation templating, we found how this actually can shape the innovator's future vision by going through this DIT process. And the reshaping of their future vision also can be reflected in what different actions they will take. And that actually shows fictional expectations. They actually, can change over the present decisions. So the argument is not we predict the future, is actually the future visions shape up our present decisions and actions. So it's not other way around. So this is, I think, kind of astonishing, effect of science fiction, because we often can hear people say, oh, we can't predict the future. Or some people say, oh, we can predict the future, and they imagine the future. But actually, is your imagination of the future, is the vision of the future, is actually, shape up your current decision and your current action. And your current action, lead to the future and you wish to achieve. I think if you look at this morning, Rolando's, and even though you spoke in very different language, but I look at your slides, I can say, the links between the fiction, the future imagination, and also, the present over reality is quite clearly recognized. Well, I think, is there any questions regarding this particular diegetic innovation templating model? Before I move on to analyze this, particular gap between the fiction and the reality.
Do we have questions? Yes, one question.
Yeah,
just a moment.
Good.
Hi, thank you so much for presentation. I have a question. Actually, I'm still confused between the differences for the I can't spell it. Diegetic innovation template. Yes. And the science fiction template.
Okay. That's very good. That's an excellent question, because actually I'm going to address that later, because in the afternoon you have a practical session. You have to understand the difference before you do that practical session. But this is a very timely question. I think it's better to explain in this context. Let's go back to the science fiction prototyping. When we look at the science fiction prototyping, we know how we're going to develop science fiction prototyping. We basically going to imagine, the future, and we're going to develop this future scenario, particularly focus on a product idea that sit in the future. So I think the science fiction prototype is a SFP, mini SFP, you're going to develop later in the afternoon for computation, is you're going to describe as what Vic already said in his part 1 session. You're going to design this little scenario, in this case, given the time, limits. So we're going to develop this mu SFP, which is a mini SFP, just a paragraph, a few sentences, and with a clear understanding who is actors in that scenario and what's the content of that scenario, what's going to happen. So you actually, the science fiction prototyping, you prototype the future scenario. So this is the science fiction prototyping. Then come back to the diegetic innovation template. They actually goes to the reverse process. And then they take the ideas, for example, the science fiction prototyping, the mu science fiction SFP you're going to develop in the afternoon, that idea can be fit in the diegetic innovation template. And the diegetic innovation template will answer the question, how are you going to transform that idea and into the reality? Realism is the outcome of DIT's focus. And I think that the future is the focus of SFP. So in the DIT, you bring all the ideas from science fiction, from fantasy, from future scenario description, from the future narratives, from the future novels, from the films, and you collect those elements and you fit in your templates. And that template is based on the innovator's idea, what product they want to design for the reality, for the present. So diegetic innovation templating is to bring the fictional setting, that's why they call it diegetic, from the fictional setting and then back to the present, back to the reality. So that's the major difference. They actually go through, a very different process. SFP is from the present to the future. And the diegetic innovation templating is back from the future to the reality. And I'm going to explain, in the next slide, in detail, how you're going to back to the reality from the future. Is that clear? Did this answer your question?
Yes, she said yes. Okay, we can go. We can proceed.
Perfect. Let's move on to the next. The next is very important. I think the framework, and we try to introduce. If you look at, as we explained, the diegetic innovation templating is help us taking, those fictional expectations, like what you desire for the future and what people really want, but they can't have in the reality. And they take those desirable elements and they're going to use those elements, think about it, how they're going to develop a new product based on those elements and from the future and back to the reality. So what's in the reality? And that's we need to look at the gap. That gap is between the fictional world and the reality. I think if we look at the future visions and the future imaginations, sometimes I would say, people can be really creative. Sometimes that's different results. We can say, when we think about the future, some people can have a very constructive future and very optimistic future. But some people, they can have a very dystopian future, very depressive, very destructive future. And they think the future will be a disaster. And they all think about the disastrous outcome. But exactly what the future would look like, no one really knows. We don't have time machine yet, so we really don't know. But what we have is, the power of expectation. In economic studies, in social culture studies, especially in economic study, and they actually emphasize how the economic activities are developed, are established based on people's expectations. So we have fictional expectations, and those fictional expectations, they're so powerful and they can shape our current decisions and make us to take actions. And that's why we need to look at what our expectations in the future and how we can bring those expectations into the reality. And this is what we call diegetic gap analysis. And this gap shows how you can achieve, your fictional expectations. And this actually, if you look at this gap, we can say there are certain dimensions, and to become the measures and for the gap. How we measure the gap? Let's say you know, we have this, you know, in the Star Trek, we have this replicator. How desirable. If we have a replicator, probably we can eliminate the poverty in the world. But in terms of a technological gap, that replicator, they have a fundamental science barrier. In terms of physics development, they can't, at the moment, we do not have that knowledge or understanding or any breakthrough how they can transform, you know, the substance and into different things. So I think this, in terms of technological gap, and you can say the replicator is desirable, but it seems implausible. The technology gap is huge, is big. Conceptual gap, actually, if you look at that conceptual gap, in terms of how we can develop that, how we can understand that, and how desirable, because this is a conceptual gap. That's the interesting thing to look at the conceptual gap. Because if you look at the current, you know, horizon scanning or current future information, emerging trends scanning, and one of the major focuses is on technological gap. But the conceptual gap, especially in the organizational settings, is more complex to understand than technological gap. Because the conceptual gap, they not only about the science fiction, this idea itself, how you perceive that idea, how much you can comprehend that idea. The innovators, they actually have a different visions. The innovators, and they have, you know, their own product idea, and they're thinking, you know, how they can bring those science fictional elements and to reshape their product idea or add the competitive edge to the idea. Not only that, sometimes a lot of innovation, they never been commercialized. Why? Because the market does not have such a demand. Because the customer, they do not accept that. Educating customer is extremely costly. We know how much it costs for marketing campaign. And we know educating customer who do not have such awareness or do not have such you know, comprehension is quite a big challenge. So this conceptual gap, you can say, that include in different aspects. There's also about you know, the resources gap. Do you have the money? Do you have the skills to develop this idea, to realize this idea? How long they're going to take? So when we look at the gap, we also need to think about the time dimension, because I think if we look at the innovation process within organizations, we can say all the organizations, especially those large organizations, they all engage in 3 levels of innovation process. One, they focus on the existing product, the cash cow. They can have immediate return from those existing products. They also introducing, you know, or investing in developing new product to replace their existing product, because every product has a life cycle. Some products longer, sometimes in the consumable or fast moving consumer goods industry, the life cycle is very short. L'Oreal, they are in the consumable, fast moving consumer goods industry. They introduce over thousands new products every year, and their intensity of innovation in their organization is extremely high and intensive because the very short product life cycle. We live in a digital, you know, technology age, so we can say what technology advancement, you know, have impacted on the business is they shortened the product life. So what that means? That means this is a growing importance about understanding the future, because the company, they only invested in the existing product or the replacement products for the short term is no longer sufficient. And they have to understand the future. They have to understand those disruptors. They have to understand, and how they can develop the products for the long term, for 5 years, 10 years, or maybe you can look at 20 or 30 years. As Vic introduced about Intel. Intel is obviously they focus on the future product development. They introduced the products actually, projected in 20, 30 years time. So for those market leaders, they actually thinking more further and than those followers. That's how they become market leader. Nokia failed and to follow this innovation development, and they failed and to invest in new products. So we can say, Nokia, they just dropped from their leader position and are now struggling and to even survive. And they far left behind. So understanding this conceptual gap, what that can give you is that every organization, when they focus on innovation, they need to develop that called innovation capabilities. And many organizations, like in the defense companies, and they particularly focus on technology innovation, they have a particular called a capability lead. And they focus on looking into the capabilities required and for their technology innovation. What kind of capability you need. So this gap will give you the understanding what kind of capability will be required. So the company and they can through many ways to develop capabilities. For example, hiring talents. So the most, I think the most important competitive advantage for all innovating companies is the global talents fight. How can you get the best talents? Those talents, they represent capabilities. So when you identify the capability gap and you know what kind of talents, what kind of skills and you need to hire. And also there is a marketing, there is investment, there is resource allocation implications. They all can draw and from understanding and this gap. And this embedded in organizational settings. So I can show you, this is a diegetic innovation templating process. And it is embedded in organization process. So we can say, first of all, we're going to develop this perception of science fiction fantasy, which we're going to take these elements and from science fiction fantasies and different sources of literature, the films. This require the organization, all the innovators, the designers in the company to collect under those ideas from science fiction and fantasy. Like the corners going to have this the future imagination, future visions in the next year. Why are you collecting those future visions? Because those future visions, they will fit into, what you can do, what action you're going to take in order to realize those desirable visions. So how are we going to realize them? There is a transformation process. So that's transformation process, as we referred earlier, there's a diegetic gap analysis. So you're going to understand, in order to further develop those ideas into something tangible, you have to analyze the gap. The gap requiring, the information scanning, sometimes it's expert focus group to understand particular technology gaps, technology barriers, and the technology trends. That's why we can't exercise this in this afternoon's, practical session. But I think it's important to introduce this so we can say, for the future vision, it takes the different phases and to transform and to really, realize your fictional expectations. So this, I would say, the diegetic innovation templating process would be the second phase. After you collect all the visions, then that can be very structured process, and try to analyze those visions, to say what visions and can be realized, what are required to implement that, and what actions need to take, what resources needed, what skills needed, what capabilities we need to develop now, and what the timelines we can plan to achieve, and the different goals at a different time frame. So that's the next phase. But look at the transformation process. You can say this transformation process, understanding this gap is not simply about technological gap. As we explained, there is internal, external factors. And sometimes for the same idea, different organization may react differently, because every organization, they have different capabilities, different skills, and different internal factors. And in our study, we found the leadership, their organization's strategy and their culture, and sometimes can become kind of influencing factors for how realistic and those ideas and can be realized. Or you can say how willing those organizations invest in their time and the resources to work on those future products. Interestingly, there is outcome of this analysis of the diegetic gap. They come with different outcomes. One is they can say the gap is small, and they can say, investing certain amount of resources and the time, probably they can realize the idea within 3 years, or sometimes they can say the gap actually can be minimal and they can realize that immediately. Sometimes they designed that can be realized in 5 years or 10 years. And then that's the gap with a plan to fill, the gap with the action and to take. The gap is going to put in implementation, but there's also unfilled gap. So the interesting question in our empirical investigation is to look at what happened to those unfilled gap. So they just discard them, totally abandon them. What happened to those unfilled gap? And we found those unfilled gap, we call it, they have implicit impact on the organization's process. And those unfilled gap actually, give them like sometime a weak call. Oh, we never realized that. Probably when we decide our strategy and we need to think, to consider differently, we found those unfilled gap also have the impact on changing people's mindset, on changing people's vision and the strategy, managing under their future. Because every organization, they have to manage their future. They have to think about what their organization will be in 20 years time, 30 years time in the future, in order to remain in the competition. And they have to come up with some, very effective strategy. Nokia failed in predicting the future, and then that's how they left behind. And then, of course, for those filled gap, and they become a more explicit idea. And those explicit idea become a clear concept and a prototype. And the outcome of this is a new product innovation. And then based on the implementation feedback, and they actually, going to again fit in their back in this process and to re-question their innovation capabilities. And because we talk about this innovation capability, because the market is constant, rapidly changing. So they need this agile or dynamic capabilities. That means that their capabilities need to be changed and their resources need to be changed. So that's basically the innovation diegetic process. I want to ask you, do you have any question about the DIG and the DIT process? Before I move on the illustration of examples to show you, how the organization utilized under those DIT to come up with a product, a real product innovation. So that will be illustration for example. But before I do that example, I just want to anyone about, because this is a little bit complicated process, probably within 10 minutes explanation. I'm not too sure how much you actually can get this.
So do we have questions? Pinka, I think we don't have questions, but I have to say that we have, or you have 15 minutes till the lunch break.
Okay, 15 minutes.
Okay.
All right, okay. Well, I think what we made is pretty simple, is about the example. And one example is a fashion company. As I said, this our research, empirical investigation is to investigating those we called non-science industries. Fashion company, marketing company, service company, manufacture company. So we want to say, what the role of the science fiction or fantasies in impacting their product innovation. So in the fashion company, we all understand, how quick those copycat can act. And especially in the fashion industry, people, the market players, they do not every fashion company had the resources to do the fashion show, to hire the models, to have the top-notch designers. So many companies, they copycat, they just copy. And then this is a place, the pressure on those companies who are doing the original innovation. And this is one of the very successful company in China. It's actually American invested company. And interestingly, their company, they in the fashion design, and their brand is actually one of the top brand, very desirable. They are in the almost a high-end market. Their product very expensive. But when I ask them how you keep up with the new ideas, they come up with new ideas almost every 2 to 3 months. And you know how quick the fashion industry change. So when I ask them, there's so many copycats in China, in the market, how are you going to avoid them? He said, oh, no, we are not afraid of them. We welcome them to copy our ideas because we have tons of different ideas. So then the question is, where are your sources of ideas? They said, our fashion design goes very quickly. And we take all different ideas and from, the most emerging trends and fashion. For example, when the twin line movie came to the market, became very popular, immediately their company came out with the twin line themed design. They integrate elements because there is a popularity in the market. So it's interesting to say the fashion company, they linked their fashion design to the popular culture in the society and how they integrate those elements into their fashion. Of course, there is a question about whether they copy those ideas, but the thing is, if you look at that definition, I think it is very vague because they do not use, any trademarks twin line movie, and they sort. Instead, they taking those elements, they transform into their product. So in their model show, you can say, their model is just one picture. They have many pictures in that model show. They said vampire, atmosphere, and the climate, and in their model show, and their models are all dressed like a vampire because at that particular time that was the popular movie show at that time. But that trend only lasted for a couple months, and when the new movie come in, they immediately change to other themes. And there is also about the fantasy, how they take the fantasy elements and from the fairy tales and from different sources of creative fictions, literature, and into their design. So this particular picture, you can say, this is they use the Harry Potter, because Harry Potter became a global trends, and almost published in every country, and then they become very popular. So they take this, they design this cape based on the popular Harry Potter. And this cape, they said, is one of the best sell design. And then there is other example about the marketing company, how their marketing company, the Transformer movie, and it become very popular in the market, and the customer very much enjoy watching that movie. And then to capture that attention, and they designed, their this is automobile car maintenance products, washing products and maintenance wax and the other things. And they use the Transformers image. And this is also the marketing company designed, and for one of the new real estate company, they have the new house show, and they call it the digital city image. They try to create matrix effect, because the matrix film at that time was popular in the market. And the perception from the customer, acceptance from the customer, actually increased their brand awareness and the popularity. And this also the company is a manufacturer company. This company, different from other company. This company, I have to say, they are in the cashmere manufacturing. Cashmere products actually, especially the manufacturing, was in the declining trend in China. And this small business actually grow all of this tension and the challenges. So I was intrigued to say how your small company could compete other big companies. And he told me, he said, because he's a vision. He's a vision about the future. His vision of the future made him make the decision against the majority. He gave me the example how he made that. For example, the labor in China was very cheap, but not now. But back to 10 years ago, was very cheap. And there's, inflow of the labor from the agriculture sector and into the urban areas. And so all the manufacturers, and they all utilize that labor. But this entrepreneur, they had a different vision. He told me, he said, no, the labor wouldn't last long. The technology, the automated production line technology, that would be the future. So against all the odds, and he invested millions of dollars and into automated production line against using intensive, low-skilled labor. And all his competitors and even his peers all said, "You crazy, you're throwing money away. You're going to lose money. That because your investment will not give you any return. The labor is so cheap. Why are you investing in these products?" But he had a vision. That vision inspired by his understanding of the technology trends. He see how quick the AI developed. He also see, because he very much the fan of Germans technology. He believed and China would become like Germany in the near future, not a far future. And his future vision and his expectation actually, made the decision against all the odds. So he invested in the automated production line and invested in the future. He believed that would realize. Well, soon that trend happened so quick. It just within a couple years' time, the agriculture sector has restructured, reform all the laborers and withdraw from the urban area. And the other company, they all struggle to get the workers and to work in their low-skilled, intensive manufacturing industry. But he's an entrepreneur. That's how he become market leader, because he has automatic production line and his capacity increased 10 times. He didn't need labor. When I investigate in this company 10 years ago in 2010, they actually had over 200 people. But just within a couple of years, and they reduced to only 70 people, thanks to their automated production line. And this also, the technology enabled him and to manage multiple premises opened on different factories and with one person's management. Because at that time, I remember back in 2010 to 2007, 2010, I told him you would encounter the bottleneck because you couldn't manage the business growth if you only have this centralized management style. And he didn't agree with me. But 5 years later, I went back to his company. I found he's right, I'm wrong, because he used the technology to overcome that bottleneck. So this is an example how the science fiction and the future vision shaped and today's decision, how he gave him the competitive edge. And this is another example from a defense company. Actually, this is Star Trek. This is a product design completely inspired and by the Star Trek technology. It's called Tractor B. We all say, how amazing that Tractor B and can, maneuver, can control and the other objects. And they actually use that a similar technology. That's in the Bristol University in the UK, a research team, and developed this Tractor B, which is in the exactly same principle, but so low cost. And there is a video here. I don't know whether we have time, but probably you can have the link to look at in your own time in the afternoon. This Tractor B only cost to design that. They only, at the moment, the technology only allow them to control very light and small object, not a large one like Star Trek. But this is a breakthrough step. That's how they realize, the idea and close the technology gap and in the future. So the building the future visions, the important, I think the point we need to summarize at the end is we need to understand how future expectation can shape up our future visions. So basically, it's not we predict the future, it's we create the future. That's the importance, the power of science fiction. That's the power of imagination. They create the future. Also, I think in terms of application of SAP and the DIT, it still require a lot of investigation and the research to say how they work in different industry and the context. At the moment, we're investigating in how they work in the defense industry, but they also have been applied in the smart cities, the media, and then the medical, etc. But I think the many industry sectors has not been fully explored. So this could be a huge research gap for other innovator to follow up. Well, other thing is we also think about what to take from this workshop is we need to think about how we can make a deliberate effort, to shape our future thinking and to invest in our future capabilities. I think that is something, we definitely can gain and from this workshop. This is a kind of, I call the import templates, and give you some idea, how, because this is a template I give to my students actually. They, especially students who take entrepreneurship innovation module at the end, they're one of the assessment ask them to develop a business plan. But I found that most of the students, they struggle to come up with an idea. So that's why I introduced this methodology to them. And they first work on their, fictional idea, and then bring the fictional idea and into their innovation opportunity business planning. And then for that, they can look into this criteria from idea itself, and they need to think about how their SAP idea can be transformed to a business a concept. And in terms of market, in terms of product design, because they have to come up with their product design. That product design need to relate it to the customer's perception, customer's acceptance, and also the market demand. In terms of opportunity, and that also need to think about, that opportunity what the resources are needed, what kind of opportunity that idea represents. Because a market opportunity is different from idea. Idea is not opportunity. Opportunity is different from ideas. So they have to assess the opportunity. We have a separate framework to assess the quality of opportunities. And then there's resources. What resources are available for you to, because in the business planning, you have to come up with the resources. You have to come up with marketing plans. You have to come up with relevant skills and the finance required and to execute that idea. And then finally is technology. What technology, what the degree of technology involved in your sci-fi idea? So this is some templates I used for student developing, innovation opportunity. But this just give you the taster session. But I think this is the best to analyze after all the future visions are collected. But for this afternoon, I think this afternoon we're going to focus on developing this mini or meal SFP, which you only focus on your future imagination. I think that's all for my session for this part before we take a break. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Pink. Do we have questions? No, thank you very much. I think we don't have questions, but thank you for that very beautiful and important presentation. And now I think we will have some break, and we'll meet with you. We'll meet with you on the in the second part.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your engagement and the participation.
Thank you.
And I think I will probably come back after a break to go through the practical session with you.
Yes, sure. Thank you. We will be waiting for you. Labai ačiū. Dabar norėčiau pranešti YouTube žiūrovams, kurie žiūrėjo šią tiesioginę transliaciją, kad pirmąją dalį mes jau baigėme ir atsisveikiname su jumis iki kitų susitikimų. Tikiuosi pasimatyti. Taigi geros jums dienos. Ačiū už tai, kad žiūrėjote.